Even a man who is pure in heart and says his prayers by night may become a wolf when the wolfbane blooms and the autumn moon is bright.
The duality of good and evil is something that's been explored in storytelling since the beginning, with tales of the forces of light and dark battling against one another in a fight for the times. In ancient Greece, a monster began to awaken in their folktales, one that took the external battles of good and evil and stood as a representation of that duality existing within each of us. Werewolves are one of the oldest pieces of folklore that is still prevalent in today's society, and were deeply feared by Europeans during the medieval times, where belief of people shifting into beasts beneath the full moon was a common thing. In 1913, Universal Pictures began what would become one of the most important eras not only in horror but in filmmaking in general with the Universal Monsters franchise, beginning with an adaptation of Robert Louis Stevenson's Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. While the vast majority of films that came out of this franchise were adaptations like Dracula, Frankenstein, or The Invisible Man, in 1941 they would introduce a new character who wasn't strictly taken from any literature, but instead was inspired by the folklore around werewolves and lycans. It wasn't the first of the Universal monster movies to feature a werewolf, with 1935's Werewolf of London predating it by 6 years. That film had a far less sympathetic take on the monster and wasn't a massive success, but that didn't stop Universal from going ahead with another werewolf-centered film. The Wolfman was written by Kurt Siodmak and directed by George Wagner, with Lon Chaney Jr. in the lead role as Larry Talbot, who would soon find himself morphing into the titular Wolfman and not realizing how creepy it is to look at people through their windows with an astronomical telescope and then force them to go out with you. Lon Chaney Jr. became very connected with the Wolfman throughout the 1940s, as he was the only actor to ever be the sole person to play their monster in every sequel, going on to call the character his baby. Although Hammer's run of monster movies were more my thing as a kid, I did grow up watching Universal monster movies every October, and there's something so unique about the way that these stories were handled in such direct fashion, with these tight run times, laser focused on telling a good old-fashioned monster story with great sets and atmosphere and depictions of these monsters that would go on to shape the way we see them today. The film got a remake in 2010, which was potentially going to get a sequel, but that never happened because it didn't do all that well. We'll save that for another day. For now, let's cozy up and take a look at one of my favorite Universal monster movies, The Wolfman. But first, a quick word from the sponsor of today's video. Ever been bored and decided to check the spam folder in your email? As funny as some of these can be, it's unfortunately a result of large companies not properly securing your data, like Ticketmaster, for example, who was recently hacked and the personal data of 560 million users was put up for sale on the dark web. That data includes their full names, email addresses, phone numbers, and even credit card information. We love being scared here, but not like that. Best case, you're getting more spam messages because of it. Worst case, it's fraud, but don't worry, because Ticketmaster said that the hack wouldn't have a, and I quote, material impact on our overall business. And it seems like they aren't doing anything to remedy this. That's nice. These huge organizations will gladly collect your data and store it in their fridge without a lock, which is why you should use Aura. Aura comes through and lets you know when any of your data was breached or leaked out onto the spooky dark web, as well as speedy fraud alerts to give you a heads up if any of that data was used to try and gain access to your credit or bank accounts, and they'll make sure your data is wiped off any data broker website so you don't get inundated with as much spam. They also offer things like transaction monitoring, a VPN, an antivirus, a password manager, parental controls, and identity theft insurance, all of which is included in one app at a price far cheaper than that out-of-print sealed collector's edition Blu-ray you're eyeing. If you use Ticketmaster, you can rest easy if you sign up for Aura, because they'll be sitting behind a curtain ready to hop out with a machete and protect your information. If you want to keep yours and your family's personal data safe, go to https://aura.com/Rocklin Graves and try your first 2 weeks for free. Link is in the description below.
Don't try to make me believe that I killed a man when I know that I killed a wolf.
Yes, yes. We're all a little bit confused.
We pick up with Larry Talbot returning to his home in Llanwelly, a village in Wales after 18 years in the United States, hoping to reconcile with his father after the recent death of Larry's brother John, whose namesake came from his father as he was the firstborn son, which meant that he was seen as his father's heir and was to inherit the estate. Now, with his brother killed in a hunting accident, Larry is the one who will ultimately inherit the wealth that his father accumulated through his contributions to the scientific community. Larry's return home is met with some tension, as his father is lamenting the fact that he hasn't seen his son in 18 years and is only now seeing him again because the other died, and He hopes that Larry will reconnect with his Welsh roots and learn to call the village home again. This setup does a nice job at reflecting the good and evil duality by having this sort of fuzziness around Larry's return, where it's nice that he's back, but it's very unfortunate that this is what it took for him to return to see his father. One of the biggest draws for me with these Universal monster movies is the just absolutely gorgeous backdrop artwork and sets that bleed so much atmosphere. They really let you lean into the fable of what you're watching. It's more of an artistic style over realism approach that I've always loved. I mean, just look at the sets for the scenes in the forest. It looks so dreamy with these bizarrely shaped and spaced trees and the low rolling fog that has no business being there, but is so important to building the distinct atmosphere. Another thing that I've always loved is how black and white filmmaking shifts the focus entirely onto the texture in the frame since there's no color to worry about. And there's a very unique artistry that goes into that look that makes it still a viable decision for some stories. I will say, if you have access to an OLED TV and the 4K Blu-ray of this movie, or any of the Universal Monster movies, good God, do yourself a favor and watch it that way, because the transfer is fantastic and the OLED makes the black and white movies look as good as they possibly can. Overall, the movie is just a damn treat visually that has aged very well, not only because of solid transfers like this keeping the technical side up to date, but also because of the unique presentation that these older films have that make them still very distinct from their contemporaries. There's this soft, dreamy look over the whole thing. It's just lovely. Now, let's bear in mind that this movie came out in the 40s, and so it's pretty safe to assume that there's going to be some shifts in culture present in the film that are a little out of the norm for what we'd expect these days. I need you to really keep that at the front of your mind when Larry watches a woman in her bedroom through the window by using a telescope and then tries to use the fact that he did that as a point of flirting with her before disregarding that the word no has any value whatsoever.
You see, a telescope has a mighty sharp eye. It brings the stars so close that you feel you can almost touch them. And it does the same thing to people in their rooms. That is, if you point it in the right direction.
Actually, don't bother keeping that in mind. I don't care if it was the 40s. It's not cool.
We'll take a little walk tonight, then we'll talk it over.
No.
See you at 8.
No.
How about tonight?
No. I told you I couldn't go out with you.
And yet you wore those earrings that I like.
Seriously, I generally don't have a tough time turning off my brain and accepting that films from any given era will reflect the functions of society at the time, but oh my sweet Jesus, watching how Larry interacts with Gwen is one of the creepiest fucking things I have ever seen, and I watch horror movies for a living. I didn't think that stalking and harassment could be considered as Rizzler material, but I stand corrected because for whatever godforsaken reason, this eventually does work for him.
We didn't come down to listening on Jenny, did we?
No.
Anyway, after completely violating her privacy and being sort of a dick to her as she tries to help him shop at her store, he winds up buying a cane from her with a silver handle depicting a werewolf and a pentagram, which is very convenient. It's rather impressive how many boxes he inadvertently checked with this purchase. It opens him up to a big lore dump about werewolves and some of the symbolism associated with them, which Gwen seems to be pretty knowledgeable on, but she's probably just cool like us.
Well, that's a human being who at certain times of the year changes into a wolf.
Unfortunately for Larry, she vehemently turns down his offer to meet up for a moonlit stroll, leaving no room for interpreting that she's being playful. But that's not gonna let a guy like Larry stop him, so he sneaks up on her from the dark after she leaves and she's standing alone in the street. In the past, I've recommended things like shitting on the floor to get a girlfriend, and surely other bizarre tactics, but I would say if you want to try and woo someone, ignoring their disinterest and jump scaring them from the dark while they're alone at night is not something I would ever recommend. One thing that you're going to get real used to hearing in this movie is a little poem about werewolves which gives some information about the beasts.
Even a man who is pure in heart and says his prayers by night may become a wolf when the wolfbane blooms and the autumn moon is bright.
They say this a lot, more than they need to, but thankfully it's a pretty cool gothic poem that I'm quite fond of. Even considering that it does start to lose its touch after the third time hearing it in a movie that's barely more than an hour long. It's not the only thing you're going to hear repeated, with the other big one being this prayer from the Romani lady who Larry and Gwen are about to meet.
So cheers around to a predestined end.
Again, pretty damn cool prayer, but I don't think it was really necessary that we hear the full thing repeated 3 separate times in the movie as the focal point of a scene. even if there's a little variation on one of them. This is one of the things that honestly does weigh this movie down for me, where it feels like a lot of the runtime is sort of spent spinning its tires without moving anywhere. It's a very simple story, and it's not like the movie drags or anything, especially since these Universal monster movies generally had pretty short runtimes, but it feels like even the hour and 10 minutes here is stretched out at times past where it needed to be. I hope you're okay with exposition.
What's this pentagram business?
Every werewolf is marked with that and sees it in the palm of his next victim's hand.
Granted, a lot of that is eased out by Lon Chaney Jr.'s performance as Larry Talbot. The dude is just fantastic in this movie and fits the bill of a character who we should feel sympathetic for so that the eventual shift into a monster that he experiences has more of a punch to it. He's a very warm character who feels like a big teddy bear a lot of the time.
No.
Alright, maybe not so great in that aspect, but overall the dude is a very pleasant main character to follow along with, and Chaney's performance goes a long way here. While he sells those moments earlier on, where he really shines is in the panic he feels as the realization of what's happening to him slowly sets in.
Yes, but it's the sign of the werewolf. They say that he can see it in the palm of the hand of his next victim.
Again, he's pulling a great sympathetic angle from the character that gives a good emotionality to the movie, which, if you ask me, is very important in telling a story dealing with the dark and light side of our own psyches. I want to feel it, and Chaney makes sure that happens.
I've still got the charm you gave me, remember?
Yeah, I know, but I'm afraid.
One odd casting decision doesn't actually have anything to do with the performances, but instead in the age gap between Lon Chaney Jr. as Larry and Cloud Rains as his father. Looking at them, they honestly could be siblings close in age. Rains was 17 years older than Chaney, so if we go off their actors' ages at least, that means that John Talbot was younger than 17 when he had his first kid. Certainly not unheard of, but it was a hell of a lot less common or socially acceptable in these days. It's not a massive issue, but I do always tend to find it slightly distracting how little resemblance there is between Larry and his father, but mostly it's just that John does not look like he'd be old enough to have a kid Larry's age. Am I thinking about it too much? Absolutely. Does it distract me? Absolutely. I do like the dynamic between the two though, so that helps at least. At the time, Bela Lugosi's Dracula had just shaken the world and essentially formed how Dracula and vampires in general would go on to become culturally ingrained in our minds, and the man himself makes an appearance in this movie as another monster. Being someone with self-preservation, Gwen brought along a friend for the totally mutually agreed upon walk to have their fortunes read, and she's the one who winds up going in first, which is where we meet Bela, the catalytic character of the film. His name is actually Bela in the movie, by the way. During Jenny's palm reading from Bela, he sees a pentagram appear in her hand, causing him to go into a panic and send her from the tent, urging her to go home as soon as possible.
Can't tell you anything tonight. Come back tomorrow.
It wasn't more than a moment ago that he was strangely thrown off by the sight of the wolfsbane that was picked up after the three conveniently walked past it on their way here, and I'm not sure if you remember, but even a man who is pure of heart and says his prayers by night can become a wolf when the wolfsbane blooms and the autumn moon is bright. Did you remember that even a man who is pure of heart and says his prayers by night can become a wolf when the wolfsbane blooms and the autumn moon is bright? I hope you remembered that even a man who is... Anyway, yeah, Bela's a werewolf and was probably the one responsible for the quote-unquote hunting accident that killed Larry's brother, and he sent Jenny off because this is the sign that indicates to Bela that Jenny will be his next victim when he transforms. Now, I think there's certainly grounds for workplace negligence here because he can see the full moon and he knows that wolfsbane is blooming, and yet he still agrees to read fortunes in the middle of the night. This is like someone working with allergies deciding to work at a vet clinic. If their allergies in question caused this hypothetical person to shift into a violent beast and murder their clients. So it's at this point where everything changes, because while Jenny was in there getting her palm read, Larry and Gwen had wandered off on a little Stockholm Syndrome-infused trot through the woods, and Jenny's screams are heard.
Stay here.
When Larry goes running after the sound, he finds her being attacked by... Oh, good, that's just a dog or a regular wolf or something. After all, we saw on the cover what werewolves in this movie look like, so at least we know that this is not that, and Larry will be fine despite being bit by it because that's just a dog. I have just received word that it was in fact not a dog, and they probably just didn't want to design a whole separate wolfman for another actor to go through makeup with just for one obscured shot of someone being attacked. Fair enough. This was Bela attacking Jenny after transforming, but thanks to Larry's unbelievably convenient purchase earlier on, he was able to kill the wolf because of the silver handle, but he was bitten in the process, which is what begins his transformation. If you're setting out to make a werewolf movie, it's more than worth your time and money to focus a huge chunk on what you have on that actual transformation, as opposed to anything of the ensuing mayhem that will follow, because it's a really good transformation scene that can give notoriety to your movie. American Werewolf in London is generally seen as the golden standard for this sort of thing, which is more than well deserved. Naturally, there's a more primitive transformation here, with the actual shift from human to werewolf either happening off-screen or through simple crossfades, but you can bet that at the time, this was extremely effective. I love Larry's reaction when he lifts his pant leg and sees how hairy it got. While the internal duality of good and evil are at the core of a werewolf story, there's also the way that it explores the fear of budding sexuality during puberty. Promiscuity was seen as a deeply sinful thing in general culture back then, a perspective that's still prevalent in certain circles, and there's no question that having someone shift from a buttoned up and kind person into a hairy beast committing horrible acts can be seen as an expression of that fear around the topic. To be clear though, the movie isn't actually like diving into this sort of thematic exploration. These themes are just sort of naturally reflective of many fears ingrained within us and within society. The focus in this movie is very much so just on a simple werewolf monster movie with some light touching on the good and evil, since Larry is portrayed as a soft person, if not also wildly creepy by today's standards. One thing that I do really like about how they portray the transformation in this movie is in Larry's first indicator that his deepest fear is actually coming true. There have been some hints up to this point, like how the wolf that Larry believes he killed was nowhere to be found and instead Bela was the one found dead, leading to some good tension surrounding Larry's initial insistence that he killed a wolf and then the slow dawning in his mind that he may have been mistaken and actually killed a person.
I killed Bela. I killed Richardson. If I stay around here much longer, you can't tell who's gonna be next.
Then there's the fact that his bite wound healed miraculously with no sign of it ever having been there, and with the idea of werewolves inextricably at the front of his mind thanks to all of the reminders, things aren't looking so good for him. The moment I was referring to is right after he meets Mileva, one of the others from the camp that Bela was at. She gives him a charm to protect him, which he passes off to Gwen thinking that it will protect her if he turns, and he's then suddenly hit with this really trippy moment which marks the beginning of his first transformation. I will say, pretty contrived way to play things out there. I think it would have been more believable that Larry would give the charm to Gwen if he didn't believe what Mileva was saying to him and he could pass it off as another way to try and win her over. But given his reaction, he seems pretty damn convinced of what Mileva said to him, so then to have the very next scene be him seemingly undisturbed and giving away the one thing that he was told would protect him is a stretch.
All right, I'll take it. What's it worth to you? I'll give you...
To show me the wound.
That's especially the case if you think about it for more than a second, because he gave it to her hoping that she would be protected when he turns. But if he kept it for himself, they both would have been fine because he probably wouldn't have turned. Or it would at least have given him a little more control over the situation. Before we carry on, there's one other cultural thing in the movie that stood out to me.
But that's no reason to hold a pagan celebration. I hear your people are coming to town dancing and singing and making merry.
Oh yeah, that sounds just awful. Anyway, Larry has now undergone his first transformation into the titular Wolfman, and I like how the design reflects the name. This isn't someone straight up turning into a wolf or anything, it's very much a combination of wolf and human. Was this likely a result of technical limitations at the time, making it not feasible to make a movie about something that would require the prosthetics and various other effects necessary to make a more traditional werewolf? Sure. But it's still a pretty damn cool look nonetheless, and I really like how it means that you can still see some of Larry in the Wolfman, so there's more of that emotional dissonance going on. There's less of a disconnect from his character than there could have otherwise been, and I think it's a great example of how creativity in art can help you overcome whatever restrictions you may be needing to work with. The design itself was originally made for that earlier werewolf movie I talked about, Werewolf of London, by makeup effects artist Jack Pierce, but he wound up having to make a new design for that film that allowed for more of Henry Hull's face to be visible, since that was necessary for the story in that movie to work. Thankfully, Pierce's work wasn't completely wasted though, since it got to be used for this movie, and it's a damn good thing that it did because it's a pretty iconic look that was gratefully reused for the 2010 remake. The makeup took 5 to 6 hours to fully apply and another hour to remove at the end of the day, and every time I hear about the hell that people have to sit through going through the applications of these sort of designs, it makes me respect them tenfold. This is commitment right here, and in this case, it certainly paid off. He only transforms a couple of times, the first one being when he kills the gravedigger and awakens the next morning with no recollection of having done so. Before his transformation, the locals had begun to suspect that he had killed Bela, which, I mean, he basically did. The bludgeoning marks match his cane, the wounds from the wolf attack are gone, and he begins to seem more and more mentally unwell as things progress.
I was caught in a trap tonight. I don't know how I got there. The old gypsy woman helped me get away.
I always feel so bad for him throughout this section of the movie, largely because of that humanity that Chaney brings to the role. It's sad to see this man who returned home to try and reconcile things with his father now be seen as a murderer and a psychopath, all because he wanted to try and save someone. He's almost caught during his second transformation, but Mileva finds him and says a prayer that frees him for a moment, allowing him to break out of the trap that had been laid out by the townsfolk and get away. Up to this point, he still didn't actually know that he had become a werewolf, since his memory would be wiped every time it happened, but this time he's left with no doubt, and when he sees a pentagram on Gwen's hand, he forces his father to restrain him in a chair so that he won't hurt her, and he plans to leave as soon as he can to put as much distance between them as possible. The love story is an odd one, both because of how he went about courting her, but also because she's already engaged to someone who seems like a decent fella.
What does he do?
He's the gamekeeper for your father's estate.
Oh.
Ouch. The movie ends with the hunting party out in the woods once again, and Larry has broken out of his restraints off screen, and it's unfortunately Gwen who finds herself face to face with the Wolfman. God, look at this shot. I absolutely love the artistry of these Universal monster movies. This is just gorgeous. Larry had given his silver cane to his father, and Sir John shows up in the nick of time and beats the Wolfman to death with it, only to be shown after Mileva's prayer that Larry had been right about what he had become, and Sir John is faced with the realization that he just murdered his only remaining son. Quite a bleak ending for the story, but it wraps up simply, which fits the simple overall narrative quite well. The Wolfman is a movie that I've always really enjoyed. It does have a bit of an awkward third act and a very abrupt ending, even by Universal monster movie standards. I would have liked some more fleshing out of the characters, and especially would have appreciated a more natural relationship between Gwen and Larry, since building up a compassionate lead is really important for this kind of thing, and the story definitely would have benefited from a bit more attention where that's concerned. I think the main issue is that the story of the movie feels very much like set dressing for them to eventually get to the werewolf stuff, but there isn't ever anything really all that interesting done with the Wolfman himself. He kind of just lurks around trees a bit, kills a dude, and gets caught in a trap. Where the movie really shines is in Lon Chaney's performance and Larry's gradual realization of what's happening to him. The arc of his character has some really good stuff going forward and injects some great emotionality into a story that would have been very empty without his presence, so I'm glad that the vast majority of the screen time is spent with him. It's also a huge help that the movie is visually a treat, and the score from the uncredited Charles Previn, Hans J. Salter, and Frank Skinner is this epic orchestral beauty. The music in these movies is always so damn good. I almost don't even need to mention it, but there's no way I'm not going to. Despite some of its drawbacks, this is easily one of my favorite Universal monster movies, and I make a point to watch it every October. Thanks for watching through to the end. I hope you enjoyed the video enough that you want to see more, and if that's the case, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell because YouTube can sometimes suck at recommending channels. A huge thank you to my wonderful Patreon supporters and YouTube channel members who are a massive help in allowing me to continue committing as much time as I can to making these videos. If you want to gain access to things like behind the scenes material or gain early access to my videos, consider supporting me on either platform. As always, thank you for stopping by Rocklin Graves. I hope you've enjoyed your stay.